Hi, everybody. Today, what we're talking about is drama. Now, when I talk about drama here, we're not really discussing what you might think. Your chapter in your textbook has a lot of different information in the drama chapter. A lot of it has to do with how films are like theater, and that stuff is actually really interesting. But for the purposes of our class, and particularly online version of our class, I want us to get down to the nitty gritty and really just get at the stuff that I think is most going to help you analyze any film that you're analyzing of your choice for your analysis project and really get at what mostly is interesting in terms of in the ways in which films are like theater. And that is that they use sets and costumes in symbolic ways to create and ratchet up drama. So you don't need to read, and if you should have done the reading already, but you don't need to read the whole chapter if you don't want to, just the sections on settings and costumes. And that's what I asked you guys to read for this week. Once you have read that, please carry on. And here is what I want you to know about it. As always, please take some notes during this. If you are confused at any point, please stop and go to the questions form that I set up for you guys and ask me a question about this, and I will get back to you and answer your questions. All right, for the purposes again of our class, we're not discussing the entire chapter on drama, but for the purposes of this, what we are going to discuss is these things. An analysis of drama is going to cover settings as characterization. It's going to cover location versus studio shoots, symbolic space, costumes as characterization, and cinematic makeup. Now, the first thing I want to just bring up is that, settings and costumes and settings and makeup are a lot like they are in film. So, for example, there are things, they can both be symbolic, right? They can both help you understand a lot about characterization, the psychological sense of where you are. They can, or where characters are in their head, and they can help you understand when and where we are in time and place. They can also help you understand things like class. But they aren't all the same, and there are things that films can do that plays really can't do. So here are some kind of side-by-side comparisons of how settings and costumes work on stage versus on film. On stage, for example, you usually only have a few sets, only a few places where the action of the film takes place. On screen, however, you can have all the sets that are needed to tell the story. It's a lot more freed up. And in fact, even when you see adaptations of plays in film format, they will usually mix it up and there will be a lot more sets than there were in the stage show. Mostly because audiences for films actually expect there to be a lot more set changes. It's something we psychologically expect. Of course, plenty of films like The Awakening that you watched for this week really don't have very many sets or very many different places that the action happens either. So it really depends on the genre and the film. But in any event, the action in a film can take place literally anywhere. On stage, these sets are often really not that detailed. They don't have like little bitty intricacies to them because audiences can't actually like see those things because they can be sitting really far away. So everything has to be kind of big. On screen, on the other hand, often makeup and sets are much more detailed. We would be able to tell if it looked like it was stagey. And the purpose, sorry, one of the values of that is that you can see really small details and they can be much more important than they could in a play. On the other hand, makeup on stage is way heavier and way bolder for the same reason that sets are not as bold and not as detailed. And that is because, again, the audience needs to be able to see the characters' faces, right? And so there's a lot of makeup. Makeup on screen can be very, very subtle. And we'll talk about more of that in a little bit when we get to that section. But here are the things which I already mentioned that are the same. So both stage and screen use sets and costumes to emphasize subtext, tone, character. Sets and costumes can be symbolic in both of these things. And on both stage and screen, sets and costumes can be anywhere on that style spectrum. Realist, formalist, classicist, anywhere in between. But just like we were discussing acting last week, you can have some characters who have kind of formalist costumes or some sets that are very formal against others that are more realist in the same film. So just to keep things in mind, you can describe single characters or single sets on this same spectrum. It doesn't have to be the whole film. We're just talking about style. All right, after this, I want us to take a second and think about the types of sets where films are actually made. So now we're not worrying about those comparisons anymore. Let's really talk about movies. All right, there are two basic types of sets that filmmakers use. One is on location shooting. On location shooting is literally like they take cameras and an entire crew and they go to a place and they actually film at that actual real place that really exists in real life. One benefit of this is that it's often a lot cheaper to actually film on location. You don't have to build the whole set, you just kind of go to the place. You don't have to worry about the decorating. You go to the place, it's already decorated. And so it can save a lot of production costs. And so a lot of realist films and a lot of lower budget films are going to film in a place that actually exists. But another benefit of this for realist filmmakers, too, is that it adds a sense of authenticity. It feels real because it is real. So, for example, the film The Awakening that you watched for this week, even though The Awakening is in many ways a formalist film, especially in terms of genre conventions, which you thought about last week, or actually, yeah, thought about last week. The film is actually shot entirely on location. There's not a single set anywhere that was actually created. Of course, they decorated it the way they needed to decorate for the film to make it work, but it's a real place. Most of it, they're actually a combination of places. I'll get to that in just a second. So the house, the huge manor house that you're looking at, is a real place. The exterior is real. The rooms inside are real. Everything you see in London is real. There are no sets in the film. It's filmed on location, and it feels very real because of that. At least the sets do. On the other hand, or similarly, depending on where these things are actually shot, on location shooting can feel really exotic. So if a filmmaker wants to feel like another world, they might go on location to the deserts, like the Sahara Desert. I mean, something like Star Wars is all filmed like in the real world, right? So all of these like exterior desert shots, all this is real places. It feels really exotic. And so real places on Earth can be used to make something feel very, very exotic. Same thing for like Mad Max Fury Road. They were in Africa and shooting in the desert. And these are real places. And so they can feel kind of exotic in that way. Realist filmmakers, as I already mentioned, prefer to film on location whenever possible. However, sometimes even a realist filmmaker needs to actually create a set. So, on the other hand, another type of set is the studio set. A studio set is a set that was built for the film at a studio, or it could be built as a like a backlot, which we're going to get to in just a second, which is a fake town or a fake neighborhood that has been set up just for filmmakers to come in and decorate it however they want to make whatever movie they want to make. And major studios have their own backlots. But in any event, studio sets, whether they're interior or exterior, provide a lot more imaginative freedom for filmmakers, and so they can literally go anywhere. I'm pretty sure your textbook, if you have the edition that I'm looking at, shows you, for example, like you can, for Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, where there's like a scene where, you know, the kids are in a bowl of Cheerios with milk. You can't do that on location, right? There's no such real place. And so studio sets can allow you to create a whole set that is a Cheerio bowl full of milk, that the Cheerios are all really massive and the characters can swim around in them. So studio sets allow that imaginative freedom, allow storytelling to go places that it couldn't otherwise go. Studio sets can also, in that same vein, depict places and things that are just not possible on location. Things that they need to be able to kind of manipulate the sound or manipulate the light and manipulate like objects in ways that they can't be actually manipulated in the real world to control the weather, for example. So it can depict things and places that are not possible to depict on location. Things like Cheerio bowls, things like the Enchanted Forest, things like that. But they also allow directors to have much, much greater control over things like the lighting, over things where the tracks and the wires go that the cameras can dolly on, where they allow much greater control of all of those things. And so because of that, studio sets are favored by formalist filmmakers. They are much more likely to want to have that control to manipulate that space. So if you're thinking about formalism, think of something like Suspiria, right? Formalist sets. There are some actual on-location shots. The exterior of the school in Suspiria is a real place. The plaza where Daniel, the pianist, is murdered is a real place. The airport at the beginning, that's a real place. But beyond that, everything you're seeing inside the school in Suspiria is a studio set. Very, very formalist, very, very bizarre, doesn't seem like the real world at all, and gave Dario Argento a massive amount of control over how to light, how to use the camera movement, how to direct the actors, because it's a real space and he could do exactly what, or a fake space, and he could do exactly what he wanted. Now, as I mentioned with Suspiria, a lot of films actually mix location and studio settings. So it may even have like multiple settings that are real places. So here, for example, when I originally usually teach this unit, where we've watched The Shining, and so I wasn't able to replace these slides here with things from films that we've watched, but the example is still really solid. The film The Shining is almost entirely shot in a studio. But it convincingly looks like a real place. And that's because it's a mix of location and studio settings. The exterior shots of the hotel are at the Timberline Lodge in Oregon near Mount Hood. The interior shots of that same hotel are at the EMI studios in England, or were built. They're massive sets and they look real, but it's not a real place. It was built from scratch just for the film. If you've seen the film The Shining, that seems crazy because it looks like a very, very real place. It's modeled after a hotel in this country, the interior, not the same as that Timberline Lodge. And so it looks a lot like some real places out there in the world, and it has these massive windows in it, and that's all just fake light, fake snow outside. It's not real, any of it, because Stanley Kubrick needed to have great control over things like the lighting, over things like the camera movement, and he wanted it to look exactly like this, like what you're seeing right there on the right. It feels very real, but it is still not real. Then you can also have films that just have multiple mixes of locations. And so I mentioned The Awakening earlier. The Awakening is all shot on location, but it's not all shot on the same location. And so filmmakers can fool you quite a bit. In fact, Rookford, the school that is the majority of the action in The Awakening, is not a real school, but it is a combination of three different houses. It's the Manderston House in Scotland, Lime Park in England, and Gosford House in Scotland. And so some of those shots are from some of those sets, interior sets are from one building, some are from another. It's all real places, but it's a mixture of those real places. All these things come together to actually create whatever image the filmmaker and the cinematographer are trying to create, and whatever stylistic sense they are trying to go for. Last point here, though, is just to remember, using this example of The Shining, for example, that realist and formalist are stylistic terms. So something is not formalist just because they shot it on a studio set. It is not how that works. It can still feel extremely real. And although most of The Shining doesn't feel real, it's an extremely formalist film. The sets in many ways feel like they're very real places. So if you were describing the sets, you could say, yeah, that feels kind of real. It can feel real, but still not be real. So don't confuse those things. Something is not automatically realist just because it's shot on location, or automatically formalist just because it's shot in a studio. You still want to kind of get a general sense of whether or not it wants you to think it is real, whether or not it is trying to open a window into the real world, or trying to take you into this fantasy land. And that is what we're using when we're trying to determine if something is realist or formalist, not just the reality behind it. Another type of set that you want to be familiar with are backlot sets, which I mentioned already just a few minutes ago. Many studios have massive, massive backlots, just pieces of land that they own, and they can create entire neighborhoods. And some of them are pretty detailed and even has some interiors that you can actually use. Universal has massive backlots. One of them that, for example, is right here on the left. That was the set for Psycho. It's on the Universal backlot. Here's what it looked like in 1960. 1963, which is 3 years after Psycho was built. You see there on the left the hotel. Notice there's nothing inside of it. All it was an exterior. I'm sorry, on the left is the house. All you can see is that just emptiness. It was all interior studio sets on the inside. Every film, every scene that you see inside the Bates mansion. But outside, all we ever needed was just that exterior, right? Going from the hotel, which is there on the right, to the mansion, which is there on the left. And notice none of that is real. It's all right there at the Universal backlot. Now the Psycho. I'm not sure if the Psycho Mansion still exists in the Universal backlot. I haven't been there in a while, but I know they have it on the Universal Studios tours for tourists who come in and visit, even the one in Florida. But it's become such an iconic building, it probably can't really be used for any other film. So it's possible it's been torn down. I should look into that. But even then, and so over there on the right, I'm going to show you another example of a backlot set. I was talking about The Shining a few minutes ago, and I'm like, hey, the exterior is the Timberline Lodge in Oregon, but look at this. So even sometimes films will actually recreate a real place on their backlot, again, to have greater control over particular scenes that need to be shot. So although a few of the scenes, exterior scenes, are at the actual Timberline Lodge in Oregon from The Shining, you'll see here that they actually built a Timberline Lodge exterior in England in 1978 in order to film the exterior shots near the end of the film where everything is covered in snow, and they had to build that very famous maze, right? There's no real maze at the actual Timberline Lodge. That would actually be impossible given the topography there, and you will notice if you watch the film ever that there's no maze on the actual on location exterior shots. They're only there on these closer up shots. But they built the entire exterior of the overlook here so that they could create the blizzard and create the maze and create the scenes where the characters are outside. So they built it just the exterior, as you can see right there. And filmmakers do that all the time, especially for higher budget films. They can recreate a real place on their backlots. Now let's get in a little bit to kind of significance. So giving you kind of like a lot of technical distinctions here, but so what with sets? So what with drama? So let's talk a little bit about sets and their capacity to be symbolic, which is really what we're getting at when we're getting at film as an art and giving you the tools you need to actually interpret the films that you are watching on your own. So keep in mind that anything on a set can actually be a symbol. A prop can be a symbol. Remember, symbol is something that equals something else, right? A prop or a set can also be a metaphor, which I didn't write here, but that is also true, that it can be like something else. And so that's what I want to get at with this dollhouse in The Awakening here for just a second. But keep in mind that decorations, the colors that are used in sets, the size of a set, the density of a set, the textures used in the decorations, and where the space is can all be really symbolic. Decorations and furniture can tell us a ton about characters, about the class, about power dynamics, about relationships between people, and psychological realities, like things like the stuffed birds that are all over Norman's office, right? At the hotel. They tell us a ton of things about Norman Bates. The decorations inside the Bates mansion also tell us a lot about how kind of diseased Norman Bates's mind actually is if we slow down and kind of look at it. Also, it looks like a really gothic space, so that spooky kind of aligns the film with horror conventions as well. And finally, color symbolism can also really matter in sets. And so you want to pay attention to the things that we talked about with photography a super long time ago. Do you see warm colors or cool colors? Do things look kind of washed out, or do they look really bold? Are they kind of sepia, like everything's kind of brownish, or are they kind of grayish? One thing you probably notice is that the film The Awakening, everything in that school and basically everything in the film, photography-wise, is so gray. It is such a colorless film. You see, for example, that shot of the dollhouse here at the beginning. That's what the dollhouse looks like after Florence turned the lights on. It is a dim, gray, sad movie all the way through, and that's a photography choice, but it's also a choice in how the sets are actually decorated. Everything at Rookford looks sad. Everything at Rookford looks empty. Everything at Rookford looks gray. Everything looks a little bit worn down. But the set itself is also really symbolic. One thing that you want to think about, and that I will ask you about in your discussion questions for the week, is to think about some of the symbolic spaces that you see in the film The Awakening. One example is, here is a symbolic space. Here is this dollhouse, right? And dollhouses, when she looks into it, it's like looking into her own mind, right? This dollhouse is a symbol of her childhood. The rooms inside of it are a metaphor for Florence's mind. And you get to see the memories that she has repressed. We get to see the deepest, darkest places that she tried to hide those terrible things that happened to her as she opens the little bitty doors inside this dollhouse. It's hard to tell if the dollhouse is even actually real or if it's literally just in her head. So it really might be literally a symbol of her repressed childhood. Nobody else ever sees it, as far as I recall in the film. So it really just might be an externalization of her memories waking up and her memories of herself in this house. We've seen some other symbolic sets, actually in every film that we've actually watched in this class, we've seen some symbolic sets. But down here is another one that's not just a prop like that dollhouse, but is instead like a whole room. If you look at Madame Blanc's office in Suspiria, right? It's crazy. What it looks like is an MC Escher painting, and you can see that over there on the left, it's all been painted in ways that the stairs don't go up or down the right way. Nothing kind of leads anywhere. You see a lot of kind of optical illusions. You see things that look real but are actually just painted onto the wall, which is very German expressionist. But you see the kind of an expression here of kind of this violent pink, this kind of violent female power color, but also there's a lot of chaos in the set and there's a lot of confusion. Things don't really make a lot of sense here, which makes sense symbolically speaking. This is kind of the entrance way to complete chaos for Susie, right? Like, this is how you find your way into the coven. The door is in this room where nothing makes sense, where everything seems a little bit unnatural. Everything seems like an illusion, like things are not the way they're supposed to be. Whereas we have an entire school, right, it's pretending to be a school, but it's actually a coven for witches. And this room is also full of a lot of illusions and a lot of confusion. All right, let's move on even more briefly to costumes. Costumes, like sets, are a really important part of drama, like theater drama, and they're also an incredibly important part of filmmaking drama. Costumes, like sets, can tell us a ton about characters, and you often don't really pay much attention to how characters are dressed. I asked you to for one of your viewing questions for The Awakening. Pay attention to how Florence was dressed, but they are an incredibly important language system in film. They actually tell you all kinds of things about characters at any given moment in the drama. They're transmitting tons of information, like, what does it tell us about this person's personality, or their class, low class, middle class, upper class? I can even tell you what country they're from, if it's kind of a regional or a traditional costume of some sort. But it can also tell you things like their self-image. How do they feel about themselves? If a character is kind of has their hair let down, or if they look kind of messy, or if their makeup is messed up, or if they're not wearing makeup, or if their clothes look rumpled or dirty, that can tell you either how they feel about themselves or something else about their psychological state or even their economic state. Characters' clothing can also, of course, tell us when and where we are. So the costumes from The Awakening set us very clearly in the early 1920s in England. We can tell. So even if we didn't know that it was England, you could at least be able to tell this was a long time ago, 100 years ago-ish. This is how people used to dress. When you are in the school, you can see that all the boys are dressed the same. That tells you we are at a boys' boarding school. When you see Maud's costume, that is a very conventional costume that a maid or a nurse or a housekeeper or someone who cared for children, like a governess, would wear in the early 20th century in a lot of European countries. It's just very, very conventional, very, very traditional. It tells you what class she is. It tells you what her role is immediately. Finally, textures can tell you things about characterization. If something seems really satiny or really rough or really smooth, that can tell you something about what we're supposed to see this character as, like really soft, right? Or really kind of glossy or glittery. And it can also help kind of set the tone, as can color. So just remember those cool and warm color symbolism, what red might mean, what blue might mean, and that will help you kind of understand a little bit more about these characters. Finally, like settings, costumes and makeup can be realist or formalist. They can range anywhere on that scale. They can be just like the rest of the film or stand against the rest of the film. So you can have one character whose costumes are more or less realist or formalist than other characters. You can have one set that's more or less realist or formalist than the other sets. And so you want to, if you do see something like that in a film that you are analyzing, take a second and think about it. What is going on in this particular space in this film that it feels so much more bizarre than the rest of the film? Like an easy comparison might be something like Marion's room in the Bates Motel, which seems totally realist. It looks like a kind of crappy, cheap hotel room would look in the 1960s, early 1960s, and compare that to kind of formalist strangeness of Norman Bates's office at the hotel with all of the birds, right? All the stuffy furniture, which feels less like you are in the real world and like you've entered some sort of gothic room in a gothic novel. Moving forward, I want to get a little bit more into how costumes actually help us understand, as an example, characterizations, how costumes can have symbolic elements. Okay, so let's talk a little bit how costumes can be symbolic. This costume comes from the film Ex Machina. You guys will remember it. This is the costume that Ava chooses. What's cool about this costume is it really helps us to really see how deliberate choices in costumes can be and how costumes can have symbolic weight. We remember this scene where Ava says, like, "Hey, Caleb, I want to do something for you," and she walks off and she very deliberately chooses amongst many wigs that she could put on this wig, and amongst her clothes, these clothes to put on. And so it gives us a chance to really think about why, right? What is it that this particular costume is telegraphing? And what way is it symbolic? And just to remind you one more time, symbol is something that equals something else, right? In this case, it's a little bit complicated, actually. We look at this and it really looks typically like something that like a grad student would wear the first time she goes to a conference, or that you might wear to church on Easter Sunday. But telling you just those two things actually telegraphs a whole lot of information. Now, one thing that we know, and we find out later on in the film, is that Ava is programmed to be the object of Caleb's sexual fantasies and Caleb's sexual desires. She was designed to look like exactly what Caleb's dream woman would look like, including the way she dresses, using the algorithms of Caleb, using algorithms designed by Caleb's or created by Caleb's search history. Right? This is what Nathan tells us later on, that she was designed perfectly to be his sexual fantasy. And in fact, then what we can think of is that Caleb is literally a reflection of Ava is literally a reflection of Caleb's sexual desires. She equals his sexual desires. This costume actually telegraphs a lot of symbolic information as well. It tells us it's bluish, kind of it's not pink, and I think pink and red wouldn't be great for this movie because it's such a grayish, greenish, bluish kind of movie that pink and red might seem a little bit too violent. It might give away that Ava is actually the femme fatale, right? That she is going to turn at some point. But right now, she is trying to be the symbol of Caleb's sexual desire. She wants to appear to be innocent, and she wants to be smart. Clearly, he wants a smart woman, and harmless, right? And so we get this kind of damsel in distress vibe from this costume. It's a little bit frumpy. Notice that even though the dress is tailored, probably up at the top, that tailoring is kind of ruined by the cardigan, which is kind of frumpy. She's wearing it in that very innocent way where you pull it down too long and you put your hands in it like a little kid. There's some acting going on in here to kind of help us understand the symbolism, but it also takes away the sense of her figure, makes her less sexual. You'll notice she's wearing thick white tights like a little kid going to church, and they're a little bit wrinkled. She's wearing flats, which are the least sexy piece of clothing in the whole world, brownish flats. And she's got this very like this very sweet, innocent, like pixie cut, right? And in fact, I mean, that is a style of femininity. It's not like it's not feminine, but it's a femininity carefully designed to appear to be intelligent. This looks like, again, a librarian or a graduate student. Appears to be very, very innocent. Notice the kind of childlike, the pattern that's kind of frilly at the bottom, the white tights. It's almost like, or practically Mary Jane's. The cardigan pulled down over her hands. And then notice also that she just seems sort of like harmless. The shade of bluish kind of purple seems so sad and seems so innocent, as well as that floral print and that texture that's kind of feminine and kind of soft. All of these things come together to kind of symbolize Caleb's sexual desire and Caleb's own sense of what a woman should be. Someone who needs to be rescued, someone who is innocent, someone who is in need of a man to come and get her. And that's everything that you get right here. But obviously, he also wants someone that deep down is very, very smart. And all of those things are telegraphed through this very perfectly designed costume. All right, last point I want to make here has to do with makeup for films. One difference that we already discussed earlier between makeup in films and makeup in theater is that makeup in a film has to look absolutely flawless. You need to believe, no matter how outlandish that makeup is, that that is real. You can't see the lines for the wig. You can't see the prosthetics. It needs to be perfect because you have characters you're going to have tons of close-ups on. And like costumes, makeup and hairstyle can actually tell us a lot about a character. They can reveal what time period we are in. Sometimes they can reveal what country you are in. They can reveal a lot about the psychological state of a character. So let's look, for example, here at Nicole Kidman. If you aren't familiar with the actor Nicole Kidman, she's in a lot of, she is a personality star. She plays a similar type of character in lots of her films, but she's also an amazing actor. That's her in both of these images. And so if you're not familiar with her, you might not realize that's actually the same person. And in fact, these two films you're looking at here came out only a couple of years apart. So it's not like she's much older in one of them than the other. They're just very stylistically different films in which she's playing very different characters. And what we know about her character is really revealed by her makeup and costume in both of these films. So, for example, at the top you have the film The Hours. The Hours Nicole Kidman won an Oscar for. It was part of her bid to become more of an actor star. It was actually pretty successful and to get out of just being a personality star. This film, The Hours, she is wearing almost no makeup. She is probably wearing makeup, right? But the makeup makes her look like she's not wearing any makeup. It feels very realist, right? The hair is very frizzy, very unkempt, and she is wearing a prosthetic nose. Like, that is not Nicole Kidman's nose. And if you look really, you can't ever see it, right? No matter how closely you look. But if you compare, you can see on the bottom here, that's Nicole Kidman's nose. Up here at the top, no, it is not, right? She is playing the author Virginia Woolf in this film, The Hours, and so they gave her the nose to make her look A, less attractive, so people would forget that she's this gorgeous, gorgeous human being, and B, make her look a little bit more like Virginia Woolf, who was not super attractive. And so Virginia Woolf had a nose that looked a little bit like that, Virginia Woolf, the writer. And so you can tell at the top, this is somebody who cares less about themselves. This is a go. You can tell by that kind of print on the dress, even though you can't see much of the dress, that this is not modern. This is probably a while ago, and it is about 100 years ago. You can tell that this is a person who is kind of maybe a little bit smarter, somebody who doesn't care so much about looking incredibly glamorous or incredibly fashionable. This is someone who doesn't have time for that kind of thing. And it might be somebody who is whose brain is a little bit disordered as well, and Virginia Woolf's brain was. And so she has very kind of like, her hair is kind of frizzy and kind of unkempt. If you look down at the bottom, you have Nicole Kidman in one of my favorite movies in the whole world, Moulin Rouge. It's a very stylized, very formalist film, unlike the one at the top. Actually, the one at the top is pretty formalist too, not in this particular shot. Different types of formalism. But further on the spectrum, so far as formalism goes, you have this film, Moulin Rouge. Came out only a couple of years before The Hours. So again, she's not much younger here, but you see much, much more glamorous makeup. In this film, she is playing a prostitute at the Moulin Rouge in the late 19th century, and you can see some of those things here. She looks very sensual. The hair is red, the dress is red, the skin is extremely smooth, extremely pale. The lipstick is very, very red. Everything here seems kind of porcelain. Everything here seems very glamorous. The super stylized kind of waves in the hair, as opposed to that frizziness up at the top. Nicole Kidman has famously very, very curly, frizzy hair, but in this film, it's super tamed and it's super wavy and it's super romantic. And this tells you a little bit more about this character, right? That this is somebody who is primed to fall in love. This is someone who's going to be the love object of another character. This is somebody who is perhaps a little bit cold and a little bit distant. And in fact, as a personality star, Nicole Kidman's characters often run to the kind of cold and distant, but deep down, there's a lot of very deep emotion. In any event, you can see how one actor can be made up to tell you all kinds of different things in two different films just using makeup. Just the same person, put them in different makeup, you could tell a ton of different things. Personality stars are a lot more likely to have a certain type of makeup that you have them wear, that you see them wear no matter what the film is. So think of like the Tom Cruises of the world, the Brad Pitts of the world. If you see the Jennifer Lawrences of the world, you're a lot more likely to have them always kind of look the same in every movie that they are in. They'll have a kind of a type of makeup that they wear, a type of hairstyle and hair color that we associate with them. Again, because personality stars often are valued for their beautiful and good looks. What you will see, though, is that if you have someone like Nicole Kidman trying to break out of being a personality star about 20 years ago, which is when these things came out, moving from one to the other, you might see them dress and change their makeup and change their what you usually associate with them to signal that they're trying to play against type and maybe try to break out of this personality star cycle and become actor stars. And so you see something like Nicole Kidman saying, I don't want to be the Satines in Moulin Rouge forever, which is the kind of roles I get. I would like to be the Virginia Woolf in this fancy biopic so I can win me an Oscar, and she did. So changing makeup can signal that the actor is playing against type, and often reward them, especially women, beautiful women, with Oscars for doing things like that. And finally, like costumes, obviously hair and makeup can be anywhere on the spectrum of realist and formalist, can be or like other characters, not like other characters in the film, and can change as a film progresses. Finally, here is something you should always ask. Now, I know I usually give you this big long list of questions to ask, but in this case, your textbook, Giannetti, gives you amazing questions to ask about sets and costumes that you can perform a methodical analysis yourself. And in fact, there are so many questions, I can't put them on these slides, and you've got the textbook. So I need you to look at that yourself if you are going to analyze sets and costumes in the films that you're interested in. So in this case, he's giving you detailed systematic questions. They are at the end of the two sections that you've been assigned to read. It says a systematic analysis of set involves considering these characteristics, and he gives you a big list, and then the same thing with costumes and makeup. They're at the end of chapter 7. You'll need to take a look at those if you want to do a systematic analysis of either of these things. Those questions are asking you to consider things like what class this seems to be, what historical era this seems to be, what the sets and costumes tell you about characters, how they kind of set a tone in the film. But then obviously, like I always tell you guys, don't forget the so what. The so what always matters. It helps us understand much more clearly how you're connecting the sets and costumes to whatever argument you want to make about a film. With that, we are done here. You are going to have some analysis of sets, analysis of makeup and costumes to think about in the discussion post this week. So head over there, and I will see you over there.